Don't let her speak. She's just here to carry plates, Richard Collins said, his voice cutting clean through the low hum of the private dining room. And just like that, every fork paused midair as the soft jazz in the background seemed to shrink beneath the weight of his words, while Naomi Carter stood still beside the long walnut table, her tray balanced steady in her hands, the polished silver reflecting the chandelier light above like a quiet mirror no one bothered to look into. Her eyes lowered, her breathing even, as if she had already decided this moment didn't belong to her even though it was unfolding around her. The room itself was the kind that made people sit straighter without realizing it. Glass walls overlooking the city 30 floors down, the skyline stretching out in cold blue lines under a fading evening sun, men in tailored suits leaning back with practiced confidence, women with sharp eyes and sharper smiles watching everything without speaking, and at the center of it all sat Richard, the kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice to own a room, but did it anyway, just to remind everyone he could. Naomi stepped forward when someone gestured for water, her shoes silent against the marble floor, placing each glass with careful precision, the faint clink of crystal the only sound she allowed herself to make. And even then it felt too loud in a room that had already decided who mattered and who didn't. But she didn't rush, didn't shrink, didn't react, because she had learned a long time ago that silence, when chosen, could be stronger than anything said out loud. You missed his glass, Richard added without looking at her, a small smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth as if he were correcting something trivial, something expected, and a few people at the table let out quiet, polite chuckles, the kind that followed power without thinking, and Naomi simply nodded once, shifting slightly to adjust the tray, her fingers tightening just enough to steady the weight as she reached across the table, the scent of citrus polish and expensive cologne mixing in the air, her reflection briefly appearing in the dark surface of the contract folder lying open in front of him, a thick stack of pages marked with tabs and signatures waiting to happen. For a split second, her gaze lingered there, not curious, not distracted, but focused in a way that didn't match the role she had been assigned, her eyes tracing a line, then another, something small, buried, easy to miss unless you knew exactly what you were looking at, and then she looked away just as quickly, like nothing had happened at all. You ever notice how quiet they are? Someone across the table said under their breath, not quite a whisper, not quite a joke, and another voice answered, "That's the job," followed by a soft laugh that faded into the hum of the room again. But Naomi didn't respond, didn't flinch, didn't even blink longer than necessary as she stepped back into place, her posture straight, her presence almost invisible by design, except for the way her fingers now rested just a little too still against the edge of the tray, as if holding onto something more than balance. At the head of the table, Richard picked up his pen, rolling it once between his fingers before tapping it lightly against the paper, the sound sharp, deliberate, a signal that the moment everyone had been waiting for was finally here. And one by one, the conversations died down until only the faint buzz of the city far below remained, the contract lying open under the glow of the chandelier, the ink ready, the decision seconds away, and in that suspended breath between intention and action, Naomi's eyes lifted again, just slightly, just enough to see the line no one else had truly seen. Her heart steady, her voice still waiting somewhere deep and quiet, not out of fear, not out of doubt, but because she understood something the rest of the room didn't yet realize, that silence, held long enough, could turn into something far more powerful than words. "Go ahead, Richard," someone said softly from the far end of the table, breaking the stillness just enough to let the moment breathe again. And a few heads nodded as if permission had already been decided long before anyone spoke, while Richard adjusted his cufflinks with slow precision, the faint glint of polished metal catching the overhead light as his pen hovered an inch above the paper, not quite touching, not quite committing, his confidence still intact, but now carrying the slightest trace of performance, like a man aware that every eye in the room was watching him finish what he had started. Naomi remained exactly where she was, just off to the side, her tray now empty, her hands resting lightly along its edge as if it were the only solid thing grounding her in a room that felt increasingly suspended between two outcomes no one had named yet. Her gaze lowered again, but not unfocused, not absent, instead fixed somewhere just beyond the surface of things, where details mattered more than appearances, where a single line buried deep in legal language could carry consequences heavier than the entire room combined. "This is straightforward," Richard said, his voice returning to that smooth, controlled tone that had led the meeting from the beginning, the kind of voice that reassured investors and silenced doubt without needing to explain itself. And as he spoke, a few people leaned back in their chairs, tension easing, glasses lifted again, the quiet rhythm of confidence reassembling piece by piece, as if the interruption of silence had been nothing more than a passing pause. Naomi shifted her weight slightly, just enough for her shoes to whisper against the marble, and for a brief second her eyes lifted again, not to him, not to the others, but to the contract itself, her mind tracing that same line she had seen before, replaying it with clarity that did not belong to chance, because she had seen language like that before, structured to sound harmless, layered to pass unnoticed, designed to move responsibility from one side of the table to the other without anyone realizing until it was too late. "You are all protected under standard terms," Richard continued, tapping the page lightly with the tip of his pen, each word landing with practiced ease. And yet something in the room had not fully settled, something subtle but present, like a shift in air pressure before a storm no one could see yet. And Naomi felt it, not in the way others might, but in the way someone does when they recognize a pattern repeating itself. Her fingers tightened slightly against the tray, the metal cool under her skin, grounding, steady, while her breathing remained even, controlled, because this was the moment that mattered, not the insults, not the laughter, not the way she had been dismissed without a second thought, but this exact second where a decision was about to be made based on something no one had truly read. Across the table, one of the junior associates leaned forward, his brow furrowing just slightly, as if something did not sit right. But he said nothing, his glance flicking briefly toward Richard before dropping back to the page. And that hesitation lingered, small but real, like a crack that had not yet spread. Naomi saw it, saw the uncertainty flicker and disappear. And something inside her shifted, not impulsive, not emotional, but deliberate, like a line being crossed quietly within herself rather than spoken out loud. The city lights outside had begun to glow now, reflections stretching across the glass walls, casting long, faint shadows across the table, across the contract, across Richard's hand as it finally began to lower, the pen inching closer to the paper, and in that narrowing space between intention and consequence, Naomi's voice remained unspoken, but no longer hidden, waiting at the edge of the moment, ready not to interrupt, not to challenge, but to reveal something that could not be ignored once it was said. Wait. The word did not rise, it did not cut, it simply existed, soft and clear, yet somehow louder than everything that had filled the room before it, and the pen in Richard's hand stopped less than half an inch from the paper, as if something invisible had caught it midair, while a few heads turned slowly, not sharply, not in shock, but in that quiet, instinctive way people react when something unexpected feels important without knowing why. Naomi did not move from her place, her posture unchanged, her hands still resting lightly against the empty tray, but her eyes had lifted now, steady and direct, not challenging, not apologizing, just present in a way she had not allowed herself to be until this exact moment. No one spoke, not immediately, because the room was trying to understand what had just happened, how a voice that had been dismissed only minutes ago now held the weight to interrupt something this significant, and Richard's gaze shifted toward her, slow, controlled, the faintest crease forming between his brows as if recalibrating a situation that no longer followed the script he had written in his mind. "What is it?" he said finally, his tone even, but no longer casual, no longer dismissive, and Naomi took a small breath, not to gather courage, but to place her words carefully, because she understood that once spoken, they could not be taken back, and more importantly, they did not need to be. "You might want to review the liability clause again," she said, her voice calm, measured, carrying just enough clarity to reach every corner of the table without needing to rise above it. And for a second, nothing happened, as if the room itself had paused to decide whether to take her seriously or let the moment pass. But then one of the attorneys leaned forward, almost involuntarily, flipping a few pages back with quick, precise movements, eyes scanning lines that had already been approved, already been summarized, already been trusted. Richard did not look away from Naomi immediately, his expression unreadable, but his hand lowered slightly, the pen no longer poised to sign, hovering now in uncertainty rather than confidence. And across the table, another executive shifted in his seat, leaning closer, drawn not by authority, but by doubt. That subtle, creeping doubt that begins when certainty is interrupted by something specific enough to be real. Naomi remained still, not stepping forward, not explaining further, because she knew the line she had seen was not something that needed embellishment. It only needed attention, and attention, once redirected, had a way of revealing everything on its own. The attorney's brow tightened, his finger tracing down the page, then stopping, then going back again more slowly, more carefully, and the rhythm of the room began to change. Conversations did not resume, glasses were not lifted. Instead, there was only the faint sound of paper shifting and the almost inaudible shift of posture as more people leaned in, drawn toward the same point of focus. "Hold on," someone murmured under their breath, not loud enough to take control, but enough to confirm that something had been found, something that had not been part of the plan, and Richard's eyes finally dropped to the document. Following the movement of the attorney's hand, the space between intention and realization closing in on him with a quiet precision that no one could interrupt now. Naomi watched none of it directly, her gaze lowering again, not out of submission, but because her part had been spoken, her role completed in a single sentence that had shifted the entire direction of the room, and yet the air felt heavier, denser. Like the truth she had pointed to was expanding, filling every corner, leaving no space for the confidence that had once dominated the table. Outside, the city lights continued to glow, indifferent to what was unfolding 30 floors above. But inside, something irreversible had begun, not with a raised voice, not with confrontation, but with a quiet interruption that had redirected everything. And as the silence deepened again, it no longer belonged to control, it belonged to realization. The attorney's finger stopped completely this time, pressing lightly against a single line as if holding it in place would somehow change what it said, and the shift in his posture was small but undeniable. His shoulders no longer relaxed, his breathing no longer even, while his eyes moved across the same sentence again, slower, more deliberate, as if hoping it would read differently the second time, but it did not. This clause, he began, his voice lower than before, lacking the easy confidence it had carried earlier, and the room leaned in without meaning to, drawn by the subtle fracture and certainty that had begun to spread. It transfers full, downstream liability. He continued, pausing just long enough for the weight of that phrase to settle. Not shared, not conditional, full liability. And a faint murmur rippled across the table, not loud, not chaotic, but enough to disrupt the controlled rhythm that had defined the meeting up until now. Richard's jaw tightened, slightly, his eyes narrowing as he leaned forward, finally focusing fully on the document in front of him, the pen now resting against the paper but no longer moving, his earlier composure still present on the surface, but something underneath it had shifted, something less certain, less absolute, and across from him, one of the investors reached for his own copy, flipping quickly to the same section, his movements sharper now, less composed, as if urgency had quietly entered the room without permission. Naomi remained still, her presence unchanged, her gaze lowered once more, but her awareness of the room had sharpened, each movement, each breath, each subtle change in tone registering without effort, because she had seen this before, not this exact room, not these exact people, but this moment, the moment when confidence begins to unravel not because of confrontation, but because of truth. That cannot be right. Someone said, the words slipping out before they could be softened, and another voice followed, quieter but firmer. It is right. I am reading the same thing. And just like that, the room was no longer unified, no longer aligned under a single direction. Instead, it fractured into quiet pockets of realization, each person confronting the same line, the same implication, the same mistake that had nearly been sealed with a signature. Richard straightened slightly, his hand pulling back from the paper as if distance alone could restore control, his gaze flicking briefly toward Naomi before returning to the contract. And for the first time since the meeting had begun, he did not speak immediately, the silence stretching just long enough to reveal something that had not been visible before: hesitation. The city lights outside reflected faintly across the glass walls, casting a cool glow over the table, over the documents, over the faces now marked by something more than confidence. And the air itself felt different, heavier, as if the room had shifted from performance to consequence without anyone formally acknowledging the change. "We need to pause," the attorney said finally, his voice steady again, but now grounded in caution rather than assurance. And that single sentence landed with more authority than anything Richard had said earlier, not because it was louder, but because it was necessary. And necessity has a way of overriding power when it appears at the right moment. Naomi's fingers loosened slightly against the tray, the tension she had been holding easing just enough to breathe fully again. But she did not move, did not step forward, did not claim what had just happened, because she understood something the rest of the room was only beginning to realize: that truth does not need ownership, it only needs to be seen. And once it is, it belongs to everyone. Richard exhaled slowly, the sound controlled but audible in the quiet, his gaze fixed on the page that had just undone the certainty of the entire meeting. And for a brief moment, the room no longer saw him as the man in control, but as someone standing in the same uncertainty as everyone else. And that shift, subtle as it was, changed everything. No one reached for their glass now, no one leaned back, and no one pretended the moment had not shifted, because it had, completely, and the weight of that realization settled across the table, in a silence that no longer belonged to control but to consequence. While Richard remained still, his hand now resting flat beside the contract, the pen set down without ceremony, without acknowledgement, as if continuing to hold it would only make the situation harder to deny. Across from him, the attorney flipped back another page, then forward again, cross-checking references, his movements precise but no longer smooth. And the faint sound of paper sliding against paper seemed louder than it should have been, echoing in the space where confidence had once filled every corner. "There is no safeguard here," the attorney said, more firmly now, his voice no longer searching but stating. And that shift, from uncertainty to confirmation, landed harder than anything before it, because it removed doubt and replaced it with fact. A quiet exhale passed through the room, not relief, but something closer to disbelief, as one of the investors leaned back slowly, shaking his head once, his eyes still fixed on the page as if trying to understand how something so significant had gone unnoticed until now. Naomi did not look up, but she felt it, the moment when the room stopped questioning whether she was right and began confronting what it meant that she was, and that difference changed everything. "How did this get through review?" another voice asked, sharper this time, directed not at Naomi, not even at the attorney, but somewhere into the structure of the process itself. And Richard's gaze lifted slightly, not to answer immediately, but to assess, to measure how far the shift had gone, how much control remained. And for the first time, there was no immediate response, no smooth explanation ready to restore order. The city beyond the glass had fully transitioned into night now, lights stretching endlessly, indifferent to the tension unfolding inside, and their reflection cast faint lines across the table, intersecting with the contract, with the hands resting near it, with the space where a signature had almost been placed. Naomi adjusted her grip on the tray slightly, not out of nervousness, but because the moment no longer required stillness in the same way, her role in it already complete. Yet she remained where she was, not stepping forward, not retreating, simply present in a room that had finally begun to see what had been there all along. Richard leaned back in his chair. Slowly this time, the movement controlled but heavier, as if the weight of the situation had finally reached him fully, his eyes shifting once more toward Naomi. And this time there was no dismissal in the look, no assumption, only a brief, measured pause, as if trying to understand something that had not fit into his earlier perception of her. "We will need to review this in full," he said at last, his voice steady again, but different now, less commanding, more measured, as if the room itself required a different kind of leadership than it had just minutes before, and no one argued, no one resisted, because the authority of the situation had changed, and with it, the hierarchy of the room. Naomi lowered her gaze again, her expression unchanged, but inside, something settled quietly, not pride, not triumph, but a simple acknowledgement that she had done what needed to be done, nothing more, nothing less. And as the meeting shifted into a different direction, one built on reassessment, rather than assumption, the silence that remained no longer erased her presence. It carried it, subtle but undeniable, through every decision that would follow. The room did not return to what it had been. It shifted into something quieter, more careful, as if every word now had to pass through a different kind of filter before being spoken, and the easy rhythm of authority had been replaced by a slower, more deliberate pace that no one could ignore. One of the senior partners cleared his throat softly, not to regain control, but to reset the tone, and even that small sound seemed to echo longer than it should have as the contract remained open in the center of the table like a question no one could yet answer. Naomi stood where she had been, but the space around her felt different now, not larger, not smaller, just noticed in a way it had not been before, as if her presence had moved from the edges of the room into its awareness without her taking a single step forward. Who drafted this version? Someone asked. The question directed across the table, but carrying a weight that reached further than a simple answer, and a few glances shifted. Between colleagues, subtle, cautious, as if no one wanted to be the first to respond without certainty. Richard remained silent for a moment longer, his eyes still on the document, tracing lines that had once seemed routine, but now carried implications too significant to dismiss. And when he finally spoke, his voice was controlled, but the confidence within it had changed, less absolute, more measured. It came through standard review, he said, though even as the words left him, they sounded incomplete, as if the process itself no longer felt as reliable as it had minutes ago. Across the table, the attorney closed the folder halfway, not shutting it completely, but enough to signal that the discussion had shifted from execution to evaluation, and that small motion carried more authority now than any directive given earlier. Naomi adjusted her stance slightly, her shoulders easing, her breathing steady, and for the first time since she had spoken, she allowed her gaze to lift just enough to take in the room again, not searching, not claiming, but observing the way everything had subtly realigned around a truth that had been invisible until it was named. A junior associate, the same one who had hesitated before, leaned forward again, this time not in doubt but in recognition, his eyes moving from the contract to Naomi and back again, as if connecting 2 points that had not previously seemed related, and that quiet realization passed through him without words, but it was there, clear and undeniable. We would have signed this, another voice said, almost to himself, and the statement did not need to be louder to carry its meaning, because everyone in the room understood exactly what it implied, not just a mistake, but a consequence that had been avoided by a margin thinner than anyone was comfortable admitting. Richard leaned back slightly, his gaze lifting from the table to the glass walls beyond, the city lights reflecting faintly in his eyes as if offering distance from the moment, and for a brief second, he said nothing, not out of hesitation alone, but because there was nothing immediate that could restore the version of control he had held before. When his eyes returned to the table, they passed over Naomi once more, and this time the pause was not analytical. It was acknowledging, subtle, almost imperceptible, but real in a way that did not require words. Naomi lowered her gaze again, not out of habit, but by choice, because she understood that what mattered had already been done, and anything beyond that would shift the moment away from what it was meant to be. The room remained quiet, but it was no longer the silence of dismissal or control. It was the silence of recalibration, of people adjusting their understanding of what had just happened and what it meant going forward. And in that silence, something had changed permanently, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that would not be undone, because once a truth is seen, it does not return to being hidden. The silence did not break. It evolved, stretching into something that carried weight rather than absence. And in that space, every small movement became visible in a way it had not been before. The slight shift of a chair, the quiet clearing of a throat, the soft tap of a pen set down with more care than necessary, as if the room itself had become aware that precision now mattered more than presence. Naomi remained near the edge of the table, but the edge no longer felt like a boundary. It felt like a position, intentional and steady, her hands no longer gripping the tray, but resting lightly against it, the cool metal grounding her as the room continued to adjust around a truth that had already taken hold. "We need a full review before this goes any further," the attorney said, closing the folder just enough to signal finality for the moment, and no one objected, no one pushed back. Because the authority had shifted from personality to fact, and fact does not negotiate. One of the investors leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table now, his earlier ease replaced by a focused stillness as he looked directly at Richard, not confrontational, but questioning in a way that did not require words. And that look lingered just long enough to make clear that the dynamic in the room had changed, subtly but completely. Richard exhaled slowly, his posture adjusting as if recalibrating not just the meeting, but his place within it, his eyes moving from the contract to the people around the table, reading the room in a way he had not needed to before. And when his gaze returned to Naomi, it held for a fraction longer, not out of scrutiny, but recognition, as if acknowledging something that had not fit into his earlier assumptions. Naomi did not meet his eyes, not out of avoidance, but by choice, her focus remaining grounded, her presence calm, because the moment was no longer about being seen. It was about what had already been revealed. Across the table, the junior associate spoke again, his voice quieter but steadier now. If this had gone through, the exposure would have been significant, and the words landed without resistance. Because no one needed further explanation, the implication clear, the outcome understood, a faint nod moved through the group, not coordinated, not spoken, but shared, the kind of silent agreement that forms when reality replaces expectation. And with it came a shift in posture, in tone, in the way people held themselves within the room. The city outside continued its rhythm, traffic lights shifting, windows glowing, life moving forward without pause. But inside, time felt measured differently now, each second carrying more awareness, more consideration, as if the room had stepped out of momentum and into intention. Naomi adjusted her stance slightly, her shoulders relaxing just enough to release the last of the tension she had been holding. And for a brief moment, her gaze lifted again, not to claim anything, not to draw attention, but simply to see the room as it now was, changed, quieter, more aware, and in that glance, there was no triumph, only clarity. Richard finally spoke again, his voice even, but stripped of the edge it once carried. "We will reconvene once this has been fully reviewed." And this time, the words did not command the room. They aligned with it, matching the tone that had already settled into place. Naomi lowered her gaze once more, her role complete in a way that required no acknowledgement. And as the meeting began to dissolve into smaller movements, papers gathered, chairs shifting, conversations forming in low, careful tones, the silence that remained was no longer empty. It was filled with understanding, and in that understanding, something irreversible had taken root, not loud, not dramatic, but lasting in a way that would shape every decision that followed. The room did not empty all at once. It dissolved slowly, like a tide pulling back inch by inch, conversations forming in low, careful tones that no longer carried the same confidence as before, and the once unified focus of the table broke into smaller clusters of thought, each person holding a different piece of what had just happened. Naomi stepped back quietly as chairs shifted and documents were gathered, her movement smooth, almost unnoticed, yet now it carried a presence that could not be fully ignored, as if the space she occupied had been permanently marked by what she had revealed. One of the assistants reached for a stack of folders, glancing briefly toward Naomi before looking away, not out of dismissal this time, but out of something closer to uncertainty, as if unsure how to place her within the new structure of the room. Across the table, the junior associate approached the attorney, pointing to the same clause again, their voices low but focused, no longer debating whether it mattered, but discussing what it meant, and that shift, from doubt to consequence, lingered in the air like a quiet echo. Richard remained seated a moment longer than the others, his posture still composed. But his stillness now carried weight rather than control, his gaze resting on the closed folder in front of him as if the absence of visible text did nothing to erase what he had already seen. Naomi adjusted the tray in her hands, turning slightly toward the service corridor, her steps measured, steady, but before she could fully step away, a voice behind her spoke, not loud, not commanding, but enough to stop her without force. Wait. It was Richard, and the word landed differently than before, stripped of sharpness, carrying instead a quieter intention that did not seek to dominate the room but to hold a single moment in place. Naomi paused, not turning immediately, her posture still composed, her breathing even, as if giving the moment space to define itself before she responded. A few nearby conversations softened, not stopping entirely, but dimming just enough to acknowledge that something was happening again, something smaller, more personal, but no less significant. Naomi turned slowly, her eyes meeting his for the first time without the barrier of role or expectation, and in that brief exchange, the difference was clear, not in what was said, but in what was no longer assumed. Richard stood, the movement deliberate, not rushed, his jacket falling into place as he faced her, and for a second, he seemed to measure his words, not searching for control, but for accuracy, as if understanding now that precision mattered more than authority. You saw it immediately, he said, his voice even, but lacking the earlier edge that had filled the room, and Naomi did not respond right away, not out of hesitation, but because the answer was already understood without being spoken. Yes, she said simply, her tone calm, steady, without emphasis, without pride, just truth. Richard nodded once, the gesture small, but genuine, and the silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt settled, as if both of them understood the weight of what had passed between them without needing to define it further. Around them, the room continued to shift, people preparing to leave, conversations resuming in fragments, but this moment stood slightly apart, quieter, more focused, and in that space, something unspoken changed, not dramatic, not visible to everyone, but real in a way that did not require acknowledgement from anyone else. Naomi lowered her gaze again, not retreating, but grounding herself, and with a small, respectful nod, she turned back toward the corridor, her steps light against the marble as she moved away from the table, away from the room, leaving behind a silence that no longer erased her presence, but carried it forward into everything that would follow. The corridor outside the private dining room felt cooler, quieter, as if the air itself had not yet caught up to what had just happened inside, and Naomi's footsteps softened against the carpet as she moved away from the polished marble and glass, the distant murmur of voices fading behind her, while the steady hum of the building returned, low and constant. Like a rhythm, she understood better than the silence she had just left. She did not rush, did not look back, her pace even, measured, her hands still holding the tray with the same calm control, though the weight of it felt different now, lighter in a way that had nothing to do with what it carried and everything to do with what she no longer had to hold inside. At the far end of the hallway, a service door clicked open and closed, a server passing by with a quick glance that lingered just a second longer than usual, as if sensing something had shifted without knowing exactly what, and Naomi offered a small nod, quiet, familiar, before continuing forward. Inside her, the moment replayed, not the words spoken, not the looks exchanged, but the exact second when the pen had stopped, when the room had turned, when silence had changed meaning, and she held on to that, not as victory, not as something to claim, but as confirmation of something she had always known, that truth, when placed carefully, could move even the most controlled spaces. Back in the dining room, Richard remained near the table, the others now gathering their things, voices low but sharper, more focused, the kind of conversations that follow realization rather than expectation, and he listened without fully engaging, his attention drifting back to the place where Naomi had stood, as if trying to reconcile the version of her he had assumed with the one he had just encountered. "We need legal to run this again tonight," one of the partners said, already pulling out his phone, urgency replacing the earlier confidence, and another voice responded, "And we need to know how this got missed," the words carrying an edge now, directed not at a person, but at a process that had just revealed its weakness. Richard straightened slightly, his hand resting against the back of his chair, his posture returning to control and form, but not entirely in substance, because something remained unsettled beneath it, something quieter, more internal, and as the room continued to move around him, he remained still just long enough to recognize it. Out in the hallway, Naomi reached the service station, setting the tray down gently on the counter, the soft sound grounding her again in a world that was simple, structured, predictable, and she exhaled slowly, not releasing tension, but marking the end of a moment that had required something different from her than anything before it. A coworker looked up briefly, about to speak, then paused, as if reading something in Naomi's expression that did not call for questions, and instead offered a small, understanding smile before returning to her work. Naomi washed her hands slowly, the cool water steady against her skin, her reflection faint in the stainless steel surface, and for a second, she met her own eyes, not searching, not questioning, just present, as if confirming that she was still exactly who she had been before she walked into that room. Nothing more, nothing less. Behind her, the door to the dining area opened again, footsteps approaching, measured, deliberate, and though she did not turn immediately, she felt the shift in the air, subtle but familiar. Now, as if the moment she had left behind had not fully ended, but had followed her, quiet and unresolved, waiting just beyond the threshold. You knew exactly where to look. Richard's voice came from behind her, quieter now, stripped of the sharp edge it once carried, and Naomi turned slowly, drying her hands with a folded towel, her movements unhurried, grounded, as if the weight of the moment no longer needed to be held in her posture. He stood a few feet away, no longer framed by glass walls and a long table, no longer elevated by the presence of others. Just a man in a quiet service corridor, his jacket still perfectly pressed. But his presence different, less defined by control and more by something he had not yet named. Naomi met his gaze briefly, not defensive, not inviting, just steady, and then lowered her eyes slightly, waiting, not out of obligation, but because she understood that whatever came next did not belong to her to initiate. Richard exhaled once, a small release that seemed to carry more weight than his earlier words, and for a moment, he did not continue, as if measuring what he intended to say against what had already happened. Most people in that room did not see it, he said finally, his tone even, but quieter, more deliberate, including me. And the admission settled between them without resistance, not dramatic, not heavy, just true in a way that did not require emphasis. Naomi folded the towel neatly and set it aside, her hands resting lightly against the counter. The stainless steel cool beneath her fingertips, grounding, familiar, and she nodded once, a small acknowledgement. That did not expand into explanation. It was not obvious, she said, her voice calm, measured. It was written to sound safe, and her words carried no judgment, no correction, just clarity, the kind that had shifted an entire room without needing to raise itself above the moment. Richard watched her for a second longer, as if trying to understand how something so understated could carry that kind of weight. And there was no answer in her posture, no sign that she saw herself as anything other than what she was in that moment, present, attentive, and done. You could have said nothing, he added, not as a question, but as a statement that held its own recognition. And Naomi's gaze lifted again, meeting his just long enough to respond without hesitation. Yes, she said simply, and that single word carried more than agreement. It carried choice, quiet and deliberate. The corridor remained still around them, the distant sounds of the dining room now softened by walls and distance, leaving only the low hum of the building and the space between two people who had just seen the same moment from different sides. Richard nodded once, slower this time, as if acknowledging not just what she had done, but what it had required, and for a brief second, there was no hierarchy in the space, no defined roles, just understanding. Naomi stepped slightly to the side, not to leave, not to withdraw, but to return to her work, to the rhythm she knew, the one that did not shift with rooms or titles. And as she reached for the tray again, her movement steady, unchanged, the moment seemed to settle fully, not as something dramatic, but as something complete. Richard remained where he was for a second longer, watching her resume what she had been doing before any of this began, and there was something in that. Something that did not align with the expectations he had carried into the room earlier. Something quieter, stronger, and as he turned to leave, his steps measured. The corridor seemed to hold on to the silence they had shared, not as absence, but as something that had already said everything that needed to be understood. The corridor returned to its quiet rhythm after he left, the soft hum of the building settling back into place, as if nothing unusual had happened. Yet the air still carried something faint, something that lingered beyond the moment itself. And Naomi felt it as she lifted the tray again, her grip steady, her movements precise, sliding back into the pattern she knew, the one that did not change based on who walked through the room or what decisions were made inside it. A server passed by with a cart of glassware, the faint clink of crystal marking a return to routine, and Naomi stepped aside slightly to let them through, offering a small nod that was returned with quiet familiarity, the kind of exchange that existed outside of hierarchy, outside of judgment, just people moving through the same space with different roles. Inside the dining room, the tone had shifted completely. Conversations no longer smooth or performative, but sharp, intentional, the kind that followed a mistake narrowly avoided. And Richard stood near the head of the table again, but not in the same way as before, his posture still composed, but his attention divided, part of him present in the discussion, part of him still tracing the moment in the corridor, the words that had not been said, the ones that had been. "We need every clause reviewed line by line," he said, his voice carrying authority again. But now it was grounded differently, not in assumption, but in recognition, and the others responded with nods, with quick agreements, not because they were following him, but because the situation required it. Naomi entered quietly to collect the remaining glasses, her presence once again aligned with the role she had been given, but the room did not treat her the same, not entirely. Not openly, but in the subtle way eyes shifted, in the brief pauses that acknowledged her passing. In the absence of the dismissive tone that had filled the space earlier, she moved with the same calm precision, not altering her pace, not seeking any change, because she understood that what had shifted was not hers to hold on to. It belonged to the room, to the people who had seen what they had missed and who now carried that awareness forward. As she reached for the last glass near the head of the table, Richard stepped slightly aside without needing to be asked. A small movement, almost unnoticed, but deliberate in its absence of assumption, and for a second, their proximity held a quiet understanding that did not need to be spoken. Naomi lifted the glass, placing it onto the tray with a soft, controlled motion, the faint sound grounding her again, and when she turned to leave, she did not look back, not because she could not, but because there was nothing left in that room that required her attention. Behind her, the discussion continued, voices steady, focused, the contract now a subject of scrutiny rather than certainty, and Richard listened, engaged, but different, his responses measured, his tone aligned with the room rather than above it, as if something fundamental had shifted in the way he moved through it. Naomi stepped back into the corridor once more, the door closing softly behind her, and the quiet returned fully, wrapping around her like something familiar, something constant, and as she continued down the hallway, tray balanced, steps even, the moment that had unfolded no longer felt like an interruption, but like a point of clarity, something that had not changed who she was, but had reminded others to see it, even if only for a moment. The night had settled fully outside, the city stretching into a grid of quiet light and distant motion, while inside the building, the rhythm of work continued with a quieter precision, as if every task now carried a little more awareness than before, and Naomi moved through it with the same steady pace. Her tray lighter now, her steps soft against the carpet, her presence returning to the flow of something familiar, something constant. In the service station, the hum of machines and the faint scent of clean glass surrounded her as she stacked the last of the collected items, each movement deliberate, each sound controlled, and for a moment, everything felt simple again, contained within the small, defined space of her role. But the quiet did not erase what had happened, it held it differently, like a reflection that did not demand attention but remained visible if you chose to look. Back in the dining room, The meeting had transformed completely, the contract no longer at the center, as a certainty, but as a problem to be solved. And Richard stood among the group, not at the head this time, but within it, his voice measured, his tone aligned with the others as they worked through the implications line by line. "We cannot afford another oversight like this," someone said, and the statement carried weight without needing emphasis, because the cost of what had almost happened was now understood by everyone present. Richard nodded once, his gaze moving briefly to the space where Naomi had stood earlier, now empty, but not forgotten, and that absence seemed to hold more presence than before, as if the moment had left a mark that could not be undone by simply moving forward. "Whoever flagged it," one of the partners added quietly, "they saved us more than we realized." And the words settled into the room without resistance, not debated, not dismissed, just accepted as fact. Richard did not respond immediately, but his expression shifted slightly, not in disagreement, but in recognition, as if the statement aligned with something he had already acknowledged in silence. In the corridor, Naomi rinsed the last glass, the cool water steady against her hands, her reflection faint in the stainless steel surface, and she paused for just a second, not to linger, but to mark the end of something, the closing of a moment that had required her to step beyond the boundaries of her role without ever leaving it. She dried her hands carefully, setting the towel aside with the same precision she had carried into the room, her movements unchanged, her presence grounded, and when she turned back toward the hallway, there was no hesitation, no need to look behind her, because everything that needed to be done had already been done. Footsteps echoed faintly from the dining room again, voices carrying just enough to be heard but not understood, and Naomi continued forward, her path clear, her pace even, moving through the quiet space with the same calm certainty she had held from the beginning. Inside, Richard remained with the group, but his focus shifted briefly, not to the contract, not to the discussion, but to the recognition that something important had not come from expertise or position or authority, but from someone who had not been expected to speak at all, and that realization lingered longer than any line of text on the page. Naomi reached the end of the corridor, the soft glow of overhead lights guiding her forward, and as she stepped into the next space, the moment behind her did not feel like something separate from her work. It felt like part of it, integrated, quiet, and complete, leaving behind a room that would not forget what had been revealed, even as it moved on. The building grew quieter as the night deepened, the kind of quiet that did not come from emptiness but from completion, as if every room had settled into its final state for the day, and Naomi moved through it with the same steady rhythm, her steps soft, her posture unchanged, carrying nothing now but the quiet certainty of having done exactly what needed to be done. The service corridor opened into a wider hallway, the lights warmer here, less reflective, and she paused for just a moment near the window at the far end, the city stretching out below her in long lines of gold and white, distant and constant, untouched by the small decisions that shaped rooms like the one she had just left. She rested her hand lightly against the glass, not to linger, not to reflect deeply, but simply to stand still in a space where nothing was being asked of her, where no one was watching, and for a second, her breath slowed, matching the quiet around her, grounding her in something that did not shift with expectation or perception. Behind her, the door to the dining room remained closed, the voices inside now reduced to a faint murmur, the urgency softened into something more controlled, more thoughtful, and though she could not hear the words, she understood the tone, the kind that follows when certainty is replaced by awareness. Inside that room, Richard stood near the table once more, but the space no longer belonged to him in the same way. It had expanded, redistributed, shaped by something he had not brought into it himself. And as he looked at the contract again, the lines sharper now, the implications clearer, he understood that what had changed was not just the document, but the way he would read everything moving forward. He stepped away from the table slowly, his hand brushing the back of the chair as he moved, the gesture absent of its earlier authority, and paused near the glass wall, his reflection faint against the city lights, not studying himself, but acknowledging something he had not considered before, that control without awareness is only an illusion, and that it takes very little to expose it. Back in the hallway, Naomi stepped away from the window, her hand lowering naturally to her side. Her shoulders relaxed, and she turned toward the exit, her path clear, her pace even, as if the night itself had opened a quiet space for her to move through without interruption. She did not think about the room again, not because it did not matter, but because she did not need to carry it forward. What had happened there would remain where it belonged, shaping those who needed to remember it. As she reached the end of the hallway, the doors opened automatically, a soft rush of cooler air meeting her as she stepped outside, the sounds of the city rising to greet her, distant traffic, a passing conversation, the steady hum of life continuing. Without pause, she adjusted her jacket slightly, not against the cold, but as a simple, habitual motion, and began to walk, her steps blending into the rhythm of the street, unnoticed, unremarked, exactly as she had been before, and yet something had shifted, not in her, but in the spaces she had moved through, in the people who had seen what they had missed. Inside, Richard remained by the window a moment longer, the reflection of the city stretching across the glass, and though the room behind him had returned to order, to structure, to decisions and next steps, he understood now that something quieter would stay with him. Not the mistake, not the interruption, but the moment it had taken to correct it, the calm voice, the absence of ego, the choice to speak when it mattered. And as Naomi disappeared into the night, her figure blending into the flow of people and light, the room she had left behind carried a silence that no longer dismissed, but remembered, a silence shaped, not by power, but by truth. And in that silence, something lasting remained, quiet, steady, and impossible to ignore.